about 1990. Until then, we didn't have the technology to separate the chromite from the UG2, which is a chromite layer with lower grades. But from then, we cracked that technology. It was Mintec, the Bryson circuit. And that effectively doubled our resources. So it's not only geologists like myself who find resources. Technologists can also double resources by finding a new processing method. And that's what Samantha referred to, is all of these chromite finds that are going off to make stainless steel in China. Though it's important to add there that 60% of your costs in making stainless steel are nickel, and we don't have the nickel. So it's not that simple. These are the mines, but no one can read that. I can read it, but I'm sure you can't. But you don't want to know all the mine names. Already we went through the main mineralization. This was either, depending which school of thought, a big batholith with fractional crystallization into layers. So for many years it was thought to be a metamorphic deposit, and the others, consecutive injections of big lava, think of it as lava silts. Platinum supply, you can see South Africa dominates, but as was said, it's a very small amount. 6 million ounces, troy ounces, is only about 187 tons, and platinum is your densest element. It's 21 times water, so 187 tons would most probably be a little lump about that size, is annual production, right? So it's a very small amount. There was a kind of a symbiosis, or whatever you call it, a mafia, between the old JCI and Johnson Matthey, where new markets were developed into drugs, etc., but the big breakthrough came on autocat converters. And as said, Anglo, until the mid-late 90s, actually owned Johnson Matthey, and most of what they had was paid for with South African services. Demand at 8 million is only 250 tons, and you can see autocats dominate demand. Jewelry, which is very fickle, it tends to track price, it comes and goes, and of course it's remelted, it comes back in. And then what has increased a lot is investment. It's still a small amount, but it is an increasing area. However, we heard about fuel cells. A 1% penetration of fuel cells into new vehicle production globally would be a 25% increase in platinum demand at current loadings, which are about 60 grams. However, they're not really going to get into cars until we get the loadings down to about 30 grams, in which case it would be a 12.5% increase in platinum demand. This is investment, both into bars coins, which is about 450,000 ounces, but what has really taken off, as you can see from the graph, is exchange traded funds, which in 2012 were about nearly 200,000 ounces. That's the total though in the graph. That was new in 2012, added. And then there's a blow up of the... So platinum is increasingly becoming virtual money like gold. You know, it has industrial uses, but it is also a form of value, of hoarding. Bullion banks hold it, etc. So it is a form of cash. South African supply went up, as we heard, and then suddenly went down in 2012, as you can see, but not dramatically. And in fact, rhodium hardly went down at all. Total supply of platinoids, if you add all of those up, is about 7 million ounces. Divide by around about 31 to get grams, and then multiply by a million. What is beneficiation? I was asked to speak about beneficiation. Politicians normally think it's only downstream. That's the narrow, you know, you're going to, I've got gold, I'm going to make jewelry. The broader definition is obviously beneficiation is the total local value added in the final product that you export, which of course includes all of your inputs. If you're importing all the inputs into mining, you've got to subtract that. So, beneficiation from mining concentration, smelting, refining, intermediate products to final manufacturing is your imports and your local VA. So ultimately beneficiation is the sum of your backward and forward linkages, right? So it's the total local content of the final thing of the AutoCAD converter. So, right, so these are from the SIM study, the critical linkages of mining, that if they're not made, you will be left with a hole in the ground like Kimberley. The first is fiscal. We heard about, are we capturing the rents, particularly the resource rents, which are those unearned rents above the normal return or above the return necessary to attract capital in the first place, and the investment of those in long-term economic infrastructure and human infrastructure in knowledge, thereby making minerals which are going to run out intergenerational. The second are your spatial. We know that from Joburg. If you look at the whole infrastructure of South Africa, it radiates from where? Right here, right? Look at the road system, the rail system, the energy system, etc. And that was put in by gold. So minerals can play a critical role, as they did in North America, as they did in many parts of Africa, in opening areas up. The third is the backward linkages, and this is a vital linkage. This is into the capital goods, consumables, the services. But in our study, we found no country had made that backward linkage that didn't make the knowledge linkages. So, no, without exception, all the countries that had got into the backward linkages, like the Nordics, they invested heavily in STEM skills: science, technology, engineering, mathematics. And then finally, the forward linkages. So these 5 linkages, there are others, but these are the critical linkages in using mining to be a catalyst for industrialization. If they're not made, I would suggest leave the mineral in the ground. It's not going away. The bushvelt's about 2 billion years old. It will be there another 2 billion years, long after we've wiped ourselves out as a species. So don't worry, it's going nowhere. And just to look at that differently is that all of these linkages are interlinked. That clearly you need the fiscal linkages to pump the knowledge linkages to get the backward linkages, etc. You can't do one without the other. You've got to maximize all of the linkages. And the pivotal one are the knowledge linkages. There are no success stories that we came across. We looked at about 30 resource-based economies, and none of them succeeded without pumping STEM skills. Basically, to quote the Finns, engineers, engineers, and more engineers. And this looks at it slightly differently. This is a diagram I did for the AU strategy, is looking at the downstream exploitation to processing, looking at all your inputs of capital goods, services, etc. Your infrastructure that then catalyzes other sectors like agriculture, manufacturing, tourism, because it starts opening up areas that do not have the rents to put the infrastructure in, whilst mining does. And finally, that mining itself becomes the feedstock into your manufacturing, particularly your ferrous and your polymers, your 2 biggest feedstocks into manufacturing. Basically use the current resource demand to kickstart a strategy. This is something I lifted from Gabriel Palmer that looks at a tale of 2 countries. One is Chile, and you can see there in 1960 it's on the manufacturing curve in terms of the number of people in the economy involved in manufacturing. Then the Chicago boys come in, and you can see there it falls to the banana curve, the PC, primary commodity curve. So it grows, but now it's producing different types of the bananas. Salmon bananas, wood bananas, grape bananas, but it's deindustrialized. And then you've got Finland does the opposite. It's a banana republic all the way to 1970, and then it moves off the banana curve, the primary commodity curve, and by 98 it's onto the manufacturing curve. Now what did they do? And it's clear that Finland deepened they made the linkages. You can see raw wood, their main resource was wood, falling. You see wood machinery, capital goods shooting up, and processed wood into fine papers, etc., shooting up. So basically, they managed to make the linkages. We have similar linkages, but they're much weaker in our industry. In South Africa, they're about 1 to 1. For every mining job, we get a direct one other job. I'm not talking about all of these other imputed jobs, etc., but in supply industries. And in Finland, it's 1 to 3, so they're getting 3 times more. And that's because we're still importing a lot of our mineral inputs. This is another story of Norway with the yellow curve is what happens with resource depletion. No matter what Anglo-American or Rio Tinto tell you about sustainable mining, we're not stupid. We know it's a finite asset. There's no such thing as sustainable mining. You will always be left with a groot gat in the end. Go to Kimberley and you'll see, or go to Stilfontein and you'll see, or go look at what's happening to Velkom. So mining is only indirectly sustainable insofar as you use the activities today to put in the platform for a competitive advantage in the future, and through making those linkages. What Norway's OG21, that's oil and gas 21 strategy, is looking at is greater technology exports, capital good, greater gas beneficiation, value addition, greater recovery through application of technology, and greater resources. All of that is obtained through R&D, HRD. Statoil alone has trained over 70,000 people since it was formed. It's investing in your people with the surpluses from your mining. And this is a very comprehensive study done by the ETLA in Finland, which unpacks their mining industry both in the inputs and the outputs. And they came up with a 6 to 1 direct generator, but 3 of those 6 are employed in other countries, so 3 to 1 in Finland. So, technology development there through the VTT, which is their CSIR, and STEM skills were absolutely seminal to get into that position where mining is now, actual mining is a minor part of the economy. Much bigger are the mining inputs industries which they sell to us, like Tamrock or Metso or Rautaruki or one of them. So, your resource input sector, why should you target it? One, you have a relatively large local market. South Africa is about 1% of the world market for washing machines or whatever, but it's 10% of the mining chemicals. Not even Europe is that big. So you have a relatively large economies of scale to start. You can develop technologies for local conditions. South Africa is now the leader in deep mining, for instance, and in wire rope over several kilometers, down to 4 kilometers, 5 kilometers now. Also, it's a national asset. Since 2002, before that, mineral rights were privately held, which is the most backward system. As we heard, your next system is this kind of, it's held by the state, and you have this free-for-all or free mining. And what I'm going to suggest here is we need to move beyond that to a system where we try and optimize what we get from every deposit, and we don't hand them out through the back door as we have been doing. So, because it's a national asset, this permits for concessioning with any condition you like. You can have local content conditions, you can have downstream conditions. Obviously you do that while still trying to attract investment. But it's WTO legit. It's like you lease a car, it's a lease. You lease a car, they say only you should drive, your brother drives, they take the car back, the same thing. You lease, you get a mining lease, you don't keep to the rules, you lose the lease. So what's been suggested is a kind of a hybrid system between the colonial plunder systems, which are Canada, US, where white man went in, staked a claim, shot up the locals, and the robber barons, Guggenheim, Rockefeller, Carnegie, all got very rich, right? What we're saying here is you want a free mining regime in the areas where there are no known state assets. So you divide your country into 3 types of geological terrains. Unknown areas where the people have no assets. partially known, and on the other extreme known. On the unknown, you allow companies to come in and to add assets to the national asset register in areas where there are no known viable deposits. They then get an exploration license, which clearly, because they're gambling, has to have a form of automaticity to a mining license. You're not going to gamble at roulette if those plastic things, you can't cash them in at the end, right? So you've got to be able to cash in. But you must have a progressive tax. Not a tax on profit, but on profitability, like a resource rent tax. And then you need all the normal charter type conditions around labor, housing, etc. And you could have minimum up and downstream milestones. For the known, you look for price discovery. Every mineral deposit is different. So you don't know what the rents are, but the private sector does. So you ask them, they must bid up the resource rent tax, they must bid up the linkages, they must bid up the infrastructure development, they must bid up skilling and local R&D. And the partially known you reserve for further work, and after the further work by your survey department or your state mining company, you either put it into the unknown or the unknown category, and finally you get a mining concession, license or right. Resource rents. For a normal business, you have inputs, labor, you pay tax, and then you have a normal return. Then very quickly, minerals have scarcity rents and differential rents, so you get these luck rents. They're extremely high. For platinum, over the last 10 years, they've been 150%. The average return on the stock exchange about 13. For iron, they were as high as 600% return on investment. And what we recommend in here is those are split between 50% resource rent tax, split between the state and the operator. PGM mining, there's a horrible quote here from the ex-Lonmin CEO. The whole disaster they've had has been with the rock drill operators, which is the guys you get rid of when you mechanize. Machines don't annually come up and want 15% more salary to do their job. Right, the potential threat is here of the 200,000 jobs, we could lose 100,000, which wouldn't be bad if that went into the inputs cluster, but it's not. At the moment, they're going to go to Sweden, Finland, and the Czech Republic, mainly because we as a country lost the plot when the massive Chamber of Mines research organization that was doing mining technology development collapsed when they transferred it, when they dropped it in '93. So today we do not have a Mining Technology Research Council. So we're not assisting our local companies like DESI, RAM or Bell in developing trackless or continuous mining such as LHDs, load haul dump vehicles, etc. That cluster, despite that, has been growing. Just very quickly, economies of scale are important. There, I've got 0 minutes left.
Your rent's up. Your rent's up.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Sorry, we are rushing and we've got 2 other speakers. Our next speaker is Ben Fine, who's a professor at the School for Oriental and African Studies at London University, and his bio is in your handouts. I won't say anything more about him. He's going to talk about the enigmas of beneficiation as industrial policy. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm embarrassed by the bio, which was the only one I had available to send within the day I had everything we should do it, so I'm sorry about that. First of all, I want to welcome this event and the ability to participate in it for all the normal reasons, but for a few other reasons as well. The first is I take the event as a symbol of de facto university independence. Of course, Marikana has shed considerable light on the South African predicament, but nowhere near as much as it should. And for me, there's a very, very significant comparison with this, it's going to be my favorite word today for some reason, the tsunami of conferences that followed the casual reference to South Africa as a developmental state within the academic world. But what's particularly pleasing about this conference, and I hope there will be many more within the academic environment, is of course it offers a different constituency that it addresses and a different set of objectives. Secondly, the colloquium locates Marikana in terms of political economy and in the wider context of which proposals for beneficiation are a part. Thirdly, this also represents, or seems to represent, some sort of shift towards acknowledging both the realities of the South African economy and the adoption of the concept of the minerals energy complex with which I would address those realities, and which others seem to be coming to do so as well, possibly for the first time. And last and by no means least, I welcome the coming to fruition of the long-standing role that my friend of 20 years or more, Paul Jordan, has played in this elevation of the proposals for beneficiation and the notion of the minerals energy complex to greater public prominence. That's my opening. But I want to turn now to a number of qualifications, reservations, and cautions. I'm a bit concerned because I'm not sure I'm going to say anything or raise any issues that haven't been raised already by the previous speakers. So here are a number of points of this sort. The first is that we have to recognize really, this is not the first time that economic and industrial policy in particular have changed tack. Indeed, over its very short 20 years of post-apartheid South Africa has experienced a bewildering tsunami of policy shifts, with scarcely a critical look back to the past in making or seeking to make the future. The second point I would make is that these policies, or these policy discourses, have lacked coherence on their own terms, and certainly coherent attachment to the realities of South African economy and society. Thirdly, indeed, I would describe these policy discourses and practices as in major part an elaborate smokescreen, whether designed as such or intended as such or not. And if you look at the recent emergence of the National Development Plan, the National Growth Path, and so on, and the relationship between them, I think this is absolutely transparent. And of course, around Marikana itself, there is another tsunami of smokescreens which go well beyond the nature of the MEC which underpins those events. In particular, as we've already heard, the post-apartheid South African economy has evolved around the continuing, if transformed, imperatives of the minerals energy complex, involving globalization of the conglomerates, their unbundling into sectoral domestic concentration, financialization with corresponding massive levels of capital flight, much of it illegal, and the accumulation of financial assets at the expense of real investment. I mean, there's no way of going forward without recognizing that the financial sector in South Africa, which takes something like 20% of GDP and spirits something like 20% of resources abroad illegally, is greater than the levels of investment within the domestic economy, which itself needs more than double the level of investment that is currently in place in order to begin to think about the sorts of policies that we have in mind. So the whole issue of the nature of the way in which the MEC has restructured itself around financialization, as well as these other aspects, is incredibly important. Of course, associated with that, there has been black economic empowerment, which has been complicit in all of these processes, sharing in ownership parasitically, without in any respect serving as a developmental national bourgeoisie. I think this reinforces the points that were made by Ray Bush in opening about the nature of the way in which Africa's minerals have not been the basis for diversification across the economy, whether industrially or otherwise. But I don't think that means we should treat South Africa as just another example of this, because the reason, the paradox really, and the challenge for South Africa is this has happened despite the quite extraordinary levels of resources that are available for this diversification. I want to make three further points, and I'll move on, which is that what we've witnessed then over the last 20 years is a global and national redistribution of the surplus available within the economy. And really the point that's been made and comes across very, very clearly is just how bountiful that surplus is within the South African economy. And yet the conditions inherited from apartheid continue to be reproduced. They're not just a legacy, they are reproduced, as Sam emphasized. As I would emphasize again, this is indicative of a precedent of the redistribution of this surplus over levels of investment and a dynamic process of accumulation within the economy of any sort whatsoever. And despite the indications of a very, very bountiful economy with huge levels of surplus, the counterpart to this within the domestic economy has been considerable dysfunctional forms of policy coordination, institutional capacity to deliver, and so on. Now, in my abstract, the one question I raise, and in a sense this more feeds upon what Ray Bush had to say as well, is, okay, at the moment we seem to be having a turn towards a more effective industrial policy, one that's more in